All right, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Whoever said that civic life is dead in the United States today? Yeah. It's absolutely fantastic to see. There's a lot of community members here and students as well. And of course, students, if you're interested in giving up your seat for a community member, I'm sure they would be grateful. I'm Jay Sexton. For those who don't know me, I'm the director of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy here at the University of Missouri. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the opening of our special lecture series, America at 250, Global Perspectives. This is an important year for the Kinder Institute. At a micro level, it is our 10th anniversary. We've been around for 10 years. Probably more important is the fact that it's the 250th anniversary of the United States and the Declaration of Independence. We can clap for that. And we can also note that anniversaries like this are occasions for celebration, but they're about more than that. This milestone invites reflection. It encourages us to pause, to take stock, to look at the full sweep of American history, where we've been and where we are going. Not only looking at that moment of origin in 1776, but everything that has happened since. The unvarnished story, both of achievements and of failures, of promises fulfilled and promises deferred. Moments of unity, but also moments like our present of deep division. Now, over the course of the coming months, we're going to be welcoming a whole host of really dynamic speakers. And what's going to be different about this is our perspective. The speakers that we're going to have here to talk about the United States at 250 come from around the world. And foreign perspectives are important. In fact, they're really, really useful. They prompt us to step outside of our own national frame, to see what seems so familiar from a fresh vantage,
Yeah, I think so.
to cut through domestic culture war lenses that narrow our understanding of the past, thereby constraining how we might imagine the future. Now, at the Kinder Institute, you probably heard me say this before, we do not tell students what to think, but we do have one rule which we enforce, and that is keep an open mind. Keep an open mind throughout these lectures. For American history looks really different when viewed from the outside in, and that's precisely the whole point of this series. Now I'm going to hand it over now to one of our accomplished students, both a graduate and now currently a graduate student in the Kinder Institute's MA program in Atlantic History and Politics, Bobby Lee from Waterloo, Illinois. How could you not study history if you're from a town called Waterloo? And one of the things we do is we always bring our students into the fold of events. Bobby's going to introduce tonight's speakers. It's going to be a conversation. We're going to have three up on stage, and again, you are in for a treat. These are three fantastic colleagues. So it's going to be a conversation. We can't make it a conversation for 300 people, but we will have somewhere a QR code, and you can use your electronic device to ask questions in real time. They will pop up on Billy's iPad, and he will try to engage with as many questions as they can. They're on your the card that you were handed when you walked in. After the event's over, we'll be going for about an hour, 15 minutes. After it's over, please join us for a reception. We're going to have drinks and some light hors d'oeuvres. And oh yes, turn off your phones, everybody. Let's turn off our phones. And with that, let's welcome Bobby Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Sexton. Hello, everybody. My name is Bobby Lee. As Jay said, I am a graduate student in the Kinder Institute's Atlantic History and Politics graduate program. Before I begin, I do want to thank all of you for coming out tonight to this great event, and we hope to see you back for this rest of this lecture series. And I have the absolute privilege tonight to introducing you to our esteemed visiting scholars who will participate in a conversation led by our own Associate Director. So, first up, we want to welcome Associate Professor in Social and Political Sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney, Tamson Pietsch. Dr. Pietsch also acts as the Director of the University of Technology, Sydney's Australian Centre for Public History. Dr. Pietsch received her undergraduate training at the University of Adelaide and earned her DPhil at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on the history of ideas and the global politics of knowledge, with a specific emphasis on universities and other institutions of learning. Her most recent monograph, published through the University of Chicago Press in 2023, entitled The Floating University, Experience, Empire, and the Politics of Knowledge, explores the 1926 experiment under Dr. James E. Lowe that sent 500 American college students around the globe on a ship in the spirit of a progressive education. Dr. Pietsch's research highlights how this grand ambition reflected both the professionalization of higher education as well as the imperial spirit that constituted early 20th century American society. Today, Dr. Pietsch will discuss her family's relationship and time in America, further investigating the relationship between international education, agrarian development, and indigenous dispossession across the settler world. Our second guest scholar for tonight is a professor in the Center of History at Paris Sciences Po, Mario Del Pero. Dr. Del Pero received his PhD in International History at the University of Milan. He researches the diplomatic and transnational history of the United States in the 20th century. Dr. Del Pero's most recent book, titled In the Shadow of the Vatican, Texan Evangelical Missionaries in Cold War Italy, and published through Cambridge University Press in 2025, tells the story of a small group of evangelical Texas missionaries who set up a mission in Italy shortly following the end of the Second World War. Dr. Del Pero's research explores how these Texas missionaries intended to promote American conceptions of democracy and religious freedom, as well as acting on their own personal anti-Catholic sentiments. Drawing hostility from the Vatican, their work showcases how the omnipresent Cold War forced all actors and sides in the story to adapt their message and strategy, revealing both the ambiguity and deep complexity regarding American and European diplomatic relations. This evening, Dr. Del Pero will describe his own experience visiting America and how this country and its culture has offered him and countless others a sense of escape. Lastly, our moderator is Kinder Institute Associate Director Billy Coleman. Dr. Coleman received his PhD in history at University College London, and his research is focused on the relationship between music and politics in early America. He most recently co-edited a book, Music in American 19th Century History, and was published through Routledge in 2025. I'd now like to invite our speakers to the stage. Please give them a warm welcome.
So wonderful to see all of you here. I wanted to begin with a quick poll. So, how many of us have been to Australia, Italy, or France? Whoa! Look at that! Okay, so how many of you know an Australian or a French person or an Italian person? Not including me, if you're a student. Okay, this is good. See, look, we're already connected, right? We all know each other, and we all know all these different people from different places. So, welcome, Tamson, Mario. Welcome to the United States. Welcome to Missouri, and welcome to Mizzou. I think if we take a quick glance at the news, we can see that we have quite a lot to talk about this evening. But also on the agenda, we have the significance of 250 years of American history from a perspective of no less than 3 different countries. So we have a lot to talk about on that count as well. And to set the stage for that, I wanted to point out that really one of the fundamental animating ideas of this series was to discuss the fact that, of course, you know, the America we have at 250 is a product of its past, right, of its 250 years of history. It's also a product of the relationships that the United States has with the rest of the world and the countries in it. And we figured that in exploring America at 250 and its 250 years of history from the perspective of people abroad, that what we might find is that that past is really big, right? There's a big past that's full of all sorts of surprising people and places and moments that we might not necessarily always think of. Sometimes it can be more complex, but always it's a lot more human place than sometimes we can be conditioned to look for when we're just thinking about whatever the present moment is and its particular needs. So I wanted to begin by offering Tamson and Mario the chance to, in some ways, just introduce yourselves a little bit more by sharing a story. So all the speakers that will come will be sharing us at least one story that speaks to the meaning of the United States and the significance that and the interactions that you may have had with Americans, and how that has shaped you personally. So, Tamson.
Thanks, Billy, and thank you so much for such a warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here in Missouri. My first actual conscious memory of the United States, when it came into my mind, you have to picture sort of 10-year-old Tamson in the late 1980s, homesick. I grew too fast, so my legs really hurt. So I had to stay home for, extended period of time. And my mother kind of deliberately left for me this old suitcase, which was full of letters that she had sent to her mother when in 1970, as a 17-year-old, she had left the wheat and sheep farm in the middle of nowhere in South Australia, very religious community, rural community, and travelled as an American Field Service exchange student to Wyomissing in Pennsylvania. And these letters were, I still remember them. I was 10 years old. These full of a kind of sense of her world opening up. She flirted with boys. I think she dated quite a lot of them. She was really good at basketball. She played in the basketball team. She was in the theatre. She really took this little high school by storm, by all accounts. And for her, it was the 1970 is a period of racial, real civil rights era. But none of this really features in her letters. For her, it's a period of personal, in which the world opened up, personal freedom and liberation. And I think one of the reasons she wanted, and she narrated this story about this year in America over and over again in her life. And I think part of it's totemic value for her. And the reason she wanted me to read it as her only daughter was that when she came back to Australia, her life really closed down. And the kinds of possibilities that this year offered her were foreclosed, in part because she married my father, rejoined this quite religious community, and got on with her life. But for me, that moment has never really left me, and it was later complemented by memories of the television coverage of the first Gulf War, and a kind of continuous cultural commentary in Australia about the iniquities of Sesame Street and American cultural infiltration, which was a real concern for my parents, unbelievably. And so, when I reached kind of university age, maturity, I had this kind of dual image of the United States as a place of self-realization. My mother, never lost that sense of the possibilities of the US that meant for her personally, and also of the US as a sort of global presence that had negative effects for those that were subject to it. And I think that it's that dual story that has stayed with me, and that I've also been interested now when I've come back to it as an academic in exploring further.
Thank you. I wasn't quite anticipating the Big Bird menace.
Well, Bert and Ernie, I mean.
Watch out. Mario.
In my case, I grew up in the 1970s, and that's when US TV series, All in the Family, Happy Days, Colombo, Starsky and Hutch, and so forth and so on, truly invaded the Italian TV. Silvio Berlusconi, the Italian tycoon, created his private TV network, competing with the two public TV channels, and so that was my first exposure to US culture. I was too little to go to the movies, and that was my discovery of the US. Now, I grew up in a small town on the Alps, on the Italian Dolomites, very small. As it is often the case in, kids, you fantasize, you look for an escape, and the US provided a kind of escape, right? It was a myth, it was an idea. You felt you had some sort of intimacy you didn't call the US US, you called it America because it was more familiar. Everyone thought that America was part of our lives. My dialect, which is a mix in the dialect of my hometown, which is a mix of Italian and German, when someone exaggerates something, the usual response is, hey, America. It means an exaggeration. It's too much. So that was my discovery of the US. Now, my first kind of memory, which is a powerful one, is linked to the Declaration of Independence, the bicentennial anniversary. Because for the bicentennial anniversary, a soccer tournament was organized in New York. Italy, England, Brazil, and Team USA played. Now, it was the first attempt to promote professional soccer in the US. The Cosmos in New York was a big deal. Pele, Beckenbauer, Kinali, and other players. So my father, who was a hunter, had built a cabin up on the mountains, which is still there, very primitive, no electricity, no running water. My wife hates it, and I love it. So 1970, when I was a child, I used to go up on the cabin with him basically every weekend during the spring and summer season. So it was early July, we went up and we had a small black and white TV. We connected the TV to the car battery and we watched the games. And it was the very first time I saw the Statue of Liberty. And it was this kind of, there was a fireplace. As I said, it's very basic, very rudimental kind of cabin. And we were watching games from New York. And there were, it was cracks, fire hoods cracks in the fireplace and fireworks for the anniversary. Now, it's kind of, as I said, my father died not long after. So it's one of my very early memories of us in the cabin, which I'm very affectionate to the cabin. It was us in the cabin watching the bicentennial Cup, as it was called. So that was my kind of introduction to the US. The very first time I saw the Statue of Liberty. Then I can go on, but basically a few years later, in 1987, I was 16, turning 17, I came to the US as an exchange student. And I spent a year, of all places, in Gary, Indiana. So it was my very first time outside the US, outside Italy, very first time outside my hometown. And I was kind of, parachuted from a bucolic touristic ski resort up on the Dolomites to deindustrializing Gary. And it was a lot of fun in the end. No, honestly, it was kind of tough at the beginning. Of course, I have many weird stories. I ended up playing soccer in Gary, Indiana most of the time because my host father was the high school soccer coach. And basically he was selecting a foreign student to have an additional player for the team, which is what I did. Anyhow, that was my discovery of the US. And from then onwards, I just kept coming back very often and studying US history and politics and doing a PhD and eventually becoming, as I like to say, an Americanist with an accent.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm loving all these stories and noticing how, with both of them really, but most clearly in this sense with Tom, is that this idea that it's a place where you can come and become yourself is really interesting. And similarly, like coming to Indiana and going to Gary, of all places, obviously. But in doing these things, is there a time when you felt like the United States was foreign? Because it feels like a lot of the time in a lot of these stories, it seems like almost more of who you are than what you thought you might have been beforehand in some cases, or it's a place that is also playing soccer, just like you might be doing, but calling it football. But is there a time where you sort of felt like the United States seemed foreign to you, or is the overwhelming kind of sense that there is something fundamentally relatable about what the United States is, or an American way of life, and is that what sort of translates, and why is that?
The rest of the world absorbs so much American culture before we ever cross the threshold of the border. So there is a temptation to think that we know about the US. And, you know, I was taken to the Fulton, Missouri 2 days ago, which is fantastic. And that main street looks like something out of a Western movie. I feel like I've been there before.
The brick district.
The what?
The brick district.
The brick district, yes. So, you know, but at the same time, as I was sort of suggesting, that always came with a riding caution, you know, for me. And Australia has foreign content limitations, and it was part of the national discourse in the 80s when our media industry was being deregulated, you know. Rupert Murdoch is a local son. Our gift to the world. And you can keep him, you can keep him. That always came with a caution as well. And to be honest, until I came to the Midwest, which I did for the first time about 5-6 years ago in 2019, America was entirely foreign to me. I dated Americans, you know, and those relationships were largely full of arguments about roundabouts and the proper use of cutlery and kind of the value of institutions, actually. Yeah, America seemed like a place where people spoke English as a different language. So you were tempted to think of it as similar, but it was actually extremely different. But the Midwest really feels a lot more like what I know Australia to be, and I think there's something very historically, you know, there's a historic reason for that, and it's also something quite intellectually interesting to think with. Australia is a settler society. The Midwest is forged not, you know, at the not at the Declaration of Independence or the signing of the Constitution, but in the 19th century. And those commonalities are really ones I can feel when I come here, for good and for ill. There's a dark and a light side to that history, and they're desperately intertwined. So in some respects, it's only in adulthood that I have come to see the similarities as well as the differences.
Yeah, multiple times, in fact. When I first came, the very first time I came as a high school student, I was picked up at the Chicago airport by the family, who was a very strange family. So they were all wearing soccer shirts, you know, of minor English teams like Crystal Palace, Sheffield Wednesday. Anyhow, we drove to Gary, and morning I got up, had eggs and bacon. First time in my life I was having eggs and bacon for breakfast. And then I told them that I was going for a walk to discover the town, to see how the town was. And so I left, and I was looking for the main square, you know. I mean, most European cities have a concentric kind of structure, right? And then you have the main square where people gather. And I began walking and walking, and there was no square. I mean, and then I stopped to have a Coke at a 7-Eleven, and I got the receipt, and it was the name of a different town from down where I was staying. So I had left my town, and I got into another town without realizing it, and that seemed so strange. Honestly, jokes aside, so odd. And it was my introduction to suburbia and to the way in which kind of life is organized in the urban structure of most of the U.S. Having said that, if you, as a historian, end up studying a country, an area which is not the one where you grew up, somehow you are driven by an intellectual curiosity, some sort of attraction, fascination, but also it's a form of escapism. You escape, you want, and to me the US has always represented a sort of escape from where I was. Even when it comes to history and historiography, the Italian historiography or French historiography has its own specific jargon, which sometimes tends to be a mix of sophistication and of opaqueness, and you know where it is sophisticated and where it is opaque. So when I went to college, I remember reading a book by an Italian historian. It was called Fascisms, plural, Fascismo, Fascismi, Enzo Collotti, a very important book. And I struggled with that book so much because of the prose, because of the jargon, because of the opaqueness, and perhaps because of its sophistication. So when I began reading, US history books, I was also attracted by how clear the prose was. I remember doing an Erasmus program, an Erasmus exchange in the UK at Lancaster University. I always pick nice places to spend a year abroad. It was Lancaster 1992, like 25% rate of unemployment. It was the only exchange program with the University of Bologna where I was studying. And I remember taking this US diplomatic history class, as it was called at the time. Now we call it the US in the world. And was assigned a book, which I still think is a great book by John Gaddis, Strategies of Containment, which came out in 19... And I just loved the way in which it was written. And then I read Michael Hunt's Ideology in US Foreign Policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was something I liked, not just about the US, I was attracted to, not just about the US, but also about how history was written, if I can say so.
Yeah, it's like there's almost something attractive about the story of the history, how it's told, and the largeness of its significance in that sense, like the way that significance is framed, is that sometimes the story of the United States doesn't have to be just for Americans. It can be sort of spread across as this is part of a global story, and that can perhaps invite some people from outside the US and find themselves within that story, even if they're not physically here. But something I was thinking about as I was listening to you as well is the sense of a shared story as well, right? Like, there's a sense that it's an American story that people can partake in, but also there's a sort of common settler history. There's elements of American history that is sort of entangled and connected up into the histories of France and Italy and Australia. And I was wondering if we could kind of shift a little bit into some of those topics and think about the ways in which the history of the United States is entangled with the histories of the countries that you're from, and perhaps if you could pick out like one or two particular like moments that might stand out as like times of real collaboration or impact between the countries that you're thinking about, and we can kind of explore what those moments might be.
Well, I can kick off because Australia in large part only exists because of the American Declaration of Independence. James Cook had been on his voyage of exploration in 1770, had identified the existence of this southern continent, gone back to Britain. Joseph Banks was trying to get people interested. People were largely uninterested. He spent 8 days there, Then the American Declaration, War of Independence, Declaration of Independence happens, and the British Empire they don't have to find a place to send the convicts, but, the convicts are gathering in the Thames, sitting in hulks on the Thames, causing lots of domestic as well as international diplomatic problems. And so there is a big fight, or there was a big fight in the 1980s and 90s among Australian historians, whether Australia was settled in order to house the convicts, or whether the Declaration of Independence kind of brings about a general turn to imperial exploration amongst the British state that results in the settlement of Australia and the resettlement of the convicts. But either way, it's the Declaration of Independence that means that Australia is settled in 1788. And really, the history of our two countries are linked from their birth, because then the second thing I would actually mention, there's lots more fun things to bring up actually, but is that our constitution in 1901, the various colonies in Australia, various British colonies federate into a nation, and they write a constitution. And that constitution is often called the Washminster. It inaugurates what's called the Washminster system, which is this combination of a Washington, like American constitution, with the Westminster British system. And so our constitution borrows very directly the American Senate, and it whacks it on top of a British lower house. And so we are forged very sort of directly from the combination of this dual inheritance. And it's, for those of you who put your hand up because you'd been to Australia rather than Italy, if you've also been to Britain, you know, it's a kind of interesting thought experiment. Does it feel more like Britain, or does it feel more like Australia, or does it feel like a bizarre combination of the two? And I think it's often the latter. There are other really key moments in Australian history which dates to the 19th century, where the gold rush, right? All these Californian gold diggers have had no luck on California, or maybe they've had some luck. And then in 1851, there's a massive gold rush in Australia, and they flood in very quickly to, it's a lot quicker to get to Australia from California than it is from Europe. And they bring all this expertise, so they're really good at discovering gold, and they also bring Republican sentiments. And in 1854, there's a thing called the Eureka Stockade. It's a rebellion, people die, it's a big fight with the government. And the leaders of the Eureka Rebellion, major moment in Australian democratic history, are citing the American Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution. So these foundational moments in our democracy are often inspired by the US as a way to offset the kind of British inheritance.
So I'm here to play France as well, which will...
How does that feel to say?
It's kind of, you know, it's not that simple. This will strike my students, as my French students, as remarkably amusing that I have to play France. So if I play France, just for a second, I guess my regular, highly patriotic, slightly nationalist French student will say that it's thanks to France that the Declaration of Independence was drafted, eventually. So basically, it's a Declaration of Independence which was meant dependence on France, because it was meant to create a state, a nation, capable of engaging in diplomatic relations, capable of being recognized, join the powers of the earth, quote unquote, and gain fundamental diplomatic and military support, which fundamental it indeed was. So the follow-up is, and I'll stop playing the French in the room, the follow-up is that basically you owe us. I mean, or you owe them. Now, moving to my my real me, the Italian. I guess the 1924, the immigration law, is a key moment, because it does end a key few decades, 4 or 5 decades of massive Italian immigration to the US, which clearly transforms the relationship between the US and Italy, or the vision of the US in Italy. Now, 4, 5 million people overall migrated to the US. Now, quite oddly, people who were emigrating from my home region, from the north, oftentimes went south to Brazil or Argentina mostly, embarking in Genoa, whereas people from the south went mostly to North America. That said, that bond became personal, family. I mean, it's very hard nowadays to find someone in Italy who doesn't have a distant relative in the US. In the case of my family, we have many in Brazil, but also some very distant relatives in Pittsburgh. So at that point, really there was kind of, America became part of Italy in many different ways. 1924 closed the doors of the US to Italians for the time being. As a matter of fact, post-1945, in the early Cold War, one of the main requests of the Italian government was to accept a new wave of immigrants. There was a surplus of labor, and then many of them benefited from the process of European integration and found a job mostly in Germany, Belgium, etc. So there was an intra-European kind of mobility. But 1924 is a crucial moment in that regard. Then just like Tamson, I could go on and on, the Marshall Plan, or even, again, if I could go very autobiographical, my hometown, as I said, is up on the Dolomites on, February 1998, a US military jet playing kind of Top Gun games, took down by accident a cable car which was taking skiers from the town to the slopes, and 22 people were killed, mostly German and Polish tourists. A local was working on the gondola car, and all of a sudden, the power and eventually, I have to say, the quasi-imperial arrogance of America became manifest, because thanks to the Status of Forces Agreement, the treaty between the two countries, 1954, the pilot and co-pilot were not tried in Italy. They were brought back, tried, and eventually acquitted by a US military tribunal in Florida. So that moment for my community, the people there, is possibly, as of today, the real moment of the encounter with the US. And it's a long story. I can tell you more, but so, I mean, if I go local, that's a key watershed. And my friends, my friends who still live there, when they meet me, basically I teach US history, I study US history, and I'm driven, as I say, by an interest, passion, you can even call it an infatuation with the US. Well, they react most of the time by mentioning that event as they just push me on that constantly.
Yes. So I'm going to try to get us to think more in those frames in a moment, but I kind of can't help myself a little bit. This like early sense of the sort of interconnectedness of, some of these three countries with the United States, I just think is so interesting, right? Australia exists because, in part, the Declaration of Independence, which is predicated in some degree on French engagement of ideas and also in the American Revolutionary War. And when the British go over to what becomes New South Wales, it's only they're only there for a week or so, maybe 2 weeks, and then a French ship just shows up because La Perouse was also reading James Cook and had heard that there was this bay, and they just, French and the British have had this awkward relationship after the war, and they kind of had an awkward little face-off. The British with their administrators and a bunch of convicts, and these French people who were off and exploring. But what it led me to think about is how one difference, you could say, between a perspective from Australia or a perspective from France or Italy is the direction to which we're looking, right? So we could look from America to the west and across the Pacific. We could look to America and from America to the east and across the Atlantic. Sometimes that feels like looking towards a so-called like old world or an old country, and all sorts of things to do with sort of coming from but then going beyond what the old country had become. And then you're going into new frontiers when it goes west and then perhaps over the Pacific. And I wondered if you felt there is a kind of difference in terms of that direction, like looking west from the United States across the Pacific or looking east and across the Atlantic.
In the way Americans understand themselves, or in the ways that Australians understand America, or
Both, really.
Yeah.
Or either.
yeah. I mean, I think the US is seen often in Australia as a big brother. And so it's there to be, you know, when Australia beat America in the America's Cup, it was like the greatest national moment ever, because you beat your brother at whatever the, you know, basketball. So I think, you know, that trajectory of time, reading time onto space, has so many problems in, you know, historiography. But I think it does have a kind of popular purchase, and it certainly had a political and a historical purchase in, say, the 1880s and 90s, when there were real progressive era exchanges between Australian sort of radical progressivism, which had been institutionalised in the 1890s, not least in racial immigration restriction, which in some ways is a gift from Australian politicians of the 1880s and 90s to the US. Marilyn Lake has written a whole book on this, so, you know, Italy has that to thank. And huge exchanges around electoral reform, around women's suffrage, around what it is to build industrial arbitration court. These were ways that America was looking very much to Australia in this period. So in some ways that's a more, you know, they both understood themselves as building new worlds in that period. You know, in distinction to the old. I think that's very much at play.
If I look at the North Atlantic, that's a remarkable space of mobility, circulation, and ultimately integration. When I say integration, it's clearly visible today if you use certain metrics like, you know, trade, foreign direct investments, movement of capital and people, and that has gone on for 250 years. So this integration is based on, as I said, circulation, which means it's not a unilateral process. A colleague of mine, Salvatore Lupo from the University of Palermo, wrote a book, a very interesting one, which was eventually translated in English, on the Italian-American mafia. And it's an interesting book because those criminal activities were part of this North Atlantic integration, and it was part of a circulation. It was not going just one way. It was, you know, going from Sicily to New York, back to Liverpool, down to Sicily again. And those mafia criminals were, in their own way, part of a transatlantic elite. Criminal, but still an elite in a way. So it's a good example of what the North Atlantic space has been. Space of integration, multiple levels. Then it became security, NATO, the North Atlantic Pact, etc., etc. So what does it tell us as citizens and as scholars? That it's, as I say, it's not a unilateral process, and you have to examine, you know, these reciprocal influences. That said, this integration has brought America, the US, in the lives of many Europeans and many Italians. Now, Italy has the second largest trade surplus with the US among EU countries after Germany, twice that of France, to remark a clear element of national superiority vis-à-vis my other me. And Germany has a largest trade surplus, but it's highly concentrated in a few industrial sectors. In the case of Italy, you have many niche industries exporting a lot to the US. And it's very interesting to look at these kind of exchanges. And I apologize, I promised the last time I go autobiographic. There is an entrepreneur in my hometown who is the owner of a sports apparel factory. It's called La Sportiva. It's very big for free climbing and shoes and stuff. And 60% of the market is in the US. He has few stores in Colorado, a big depot there. And this guy, who basically has no college degree, even lower than that, doesn't have a high school degree. He has been, moving back and forth between the US and Italy, between the valley where my hometown is located and Boulder, Colorado, for the past 25 years. And he lives this kind of, transatlantic life. So he kind of, embodies this integration, which has marked the experience on the North Atlantic, and somehow, when we say integration, have connected the two sides.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, that sort of shift between integration and creation on one side or another. So I'm going to shift this up a little bit. I'll see if you're up for this. So, okay, three quick things. It can be one of two things. So 3 things, ways in which the United States has shaped your corner of the world. The 3 most important things, the 3 quick things you can think of, or reversely, right, that Australia or France or Italy, how they've shaped our history in the United States.
Russell Crowe. Nicole Kidman. Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch's a real one, actually.
That's real.
Look, in 1941, I think it was, Australia had been plugged into British imperial defence, and then Singapore falls in the middle of the Second World War. Australia completely panicked, disillusioned. Clearly Britain can't protect them anymore, and the Prime Minister gives this turning point speech where he says, John Curtin, Australia looks to America free from any of the, I'm paraphrasing here, kind of traditional loyalties we held for the UK. And that has sort of inaugurated an era of entanglement in the US defence sphere, which, takes physical form in the presence of the US in several bases in Australia, and this recent nuclear submarine deal, which you probably don't know about, but which is called AUKUS, and commits us to we have no nuclear capacity
France
whatsoever.
is very upset.
Yeah, well,
I have to say.
we did sign with France, but then apparently they didn't deliver on the bill.
All right.
But
It was betrayal, pure and simple, but that's all right.
we should have stuck with France, because now basically we have ceded our sovereignty our defence sovereignty to the US at a moment when we would actually quite like to have a choice about that. So that's a sort of really big turning point in I can't remember what your question was, but I think that was one version of an answer to it.
So, are you asking for 3 historical
I asked
events?
for 3. Tamson technically gave me 4, I think, but I was going to...
So, off the top of my head, one is Woodrow Wilson speaking in Genoa and citing Giuseppe Mazzini, and this kind of, self-determination, democratic nationalism as a potential bond. It's a very powerful message. There was a large crowd. It's not so common to mention that episode, but it was huge for Italy at the time, at the end of World War I. So that's my first kind of, historical quasi-trivia. The second, you have the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was not just economic aid, it was not just counterpart funds. It was propaganda, it was, iconography, it was movie clips, posters, and so forth and so on. That's the moment in which the US truly arrived, not just with its soldiers, but with the power of its popular culture. So, and again, Americanization is a highly problematic category because Americanization implies a one-way process, right? Projection of power, reception of power. Whereas it's way more complicated, and the power that arrives is resisted, mediated, filtered, adapted, and so forth and so on. And the third moment, there are multiple, options. It could be the boss, the 1985 Born in the USA tour. There was one single date in Italy. It was at the San Siro Stadium. There were like 85,000 people, myself included. And Reagan tried to appropriate the Born in the USA kind of, and transform it into a patriotic message, which it was, but it was also a progressive form of patriotism. But we just didn't care. We just loved, the package and what it symbolized. And yeah, that would be my third and last kind of link to U.S. popular culture. Not the most banal one, but a form of popular culture which had a huge impact on Italians, of my generation.
So that does kind of link to my next question. And before I ask it, I'll just remind people that I do have this trusty little iPad here. So if you do have some questions, you can use that QR code and I'll see if I can answer them. But this next question also comes from the fact that several of you very helpfully submitted some questions ahead of time. And yesterday at lunch at Las Margaritas, the three of us had a fun time going through them. And at least to me, what was on the top of a lot of people's minds was, something that is perhaps shifting from this idea of Springsteen when you saw him in that moment, and this question of what is the reputation of America abroad right now? What is the sort of place of the United States in the world in this moment? But more importantly, has it changed, right? Is there something significantly different or unique about the US in this present moment as opposed to earlier moments in the past that may also have been worrying or felt dangerous or like it is a concerning time? These certainly have happened in the past as well. So I wonder if you could talk to that.
Sure. Yes. I think there is. Australia is really worried because, I've alluded to it a little more, but we have a very small percentage of our trade is with the United States, but a very large percentage of our geopolitical kind of positioning in Asia is dependent on the US. But we trade heavily with China and are highly integrated economically and now culturally with China as well. And it feels like a really difficult choice to have to make. But I think there's also an element of grief and disappointment that the US isn't living up to its ideals. And, even in the context of American empire, which is so pervasive across the 19th and 20th centuries. And one of the things that unites our two countries actually is our settler colonial continental conquest. Even in the face of that, that has always run with the kind of democratic Republican project. And it is, so there's a grief that is no longer something that can be trusted. But I think too, in Australia there is, if you zoom even further out, there is a kind of resource analysis that is being made. I don't know if this is happening in Europe so much, but it's about, renewable energy is now like 50% of our energy source in Australia. The entire national grid would collapse without it. And none of that has been because of government policy. That has all been because of basically individual households putting solar panels on their roofs because it's cheaper. And that is with Chinese chips. So there is a sort of story that is about, US rose to global prominence on oil from the last energy transition from coal to oil. And if what we are seeing is the next energy transition is from oil to renewables, the US is making a punt in that shift, which is really on the wrong side, I would argue. Or it's, maybe that's what's behind Greenland, I don't know. No, but I mean, there is a lot of precious metals in the lithium triangle, it's called, in the top of South America. So maybe some of these politicals have a rationale behind them. I don't know. You can talk about that, Murray. But it feels like America's on the wrong side of history a little bit, at a moment when we really need it.
Yeah, I guess, well, I'm going to say pretty much what Tamson just said. So there is a sense of shock for what it is said and done, and for how it is said. The kind of extremely cruel, violent language which is used, as if cruelty and violence were virtues, as if empathy is a vice, on the contrary, as a sign of weakness. So there's a shock for words and deeds, rhetoric and policy. That's for sure. And by the way, that is visible even in Italy. We have a very right-wing government. In France, we have a centrist government. But possibly the Italian government is one of has tried to play the role of the main partner of the new Republican administration, and it didn't work. The recent crisis over Greenland just, highlights the difficulty for a pro-Trump government in Europe to keep that position. Having said that, we do have studies, polls on the image of the US and of its leaders in Europe, at least from the early 2000s. From the early 2000s until 2013-14, there was this transatlantic trends, huge survey made by the German Marshall Fund. Then I guess they ran out of money, but they keep doing these polls. So we have a significant amount of data which we can use. And what do we see? Well, a couple of things are remarkable in those polls. The first one is that there is a kind of European public opinion. There are national differences, but it's a fairly homogeneous position. Yes, Hungary is a bit more pro-US. Yes, France is a bit less. But the range is quite narrow. And that was visible from the Second Gulf War onwards. So when we measure attitudes towards the US, there is an embryo of a European public opinion. That's the first point. The second point is that there are huge, massive swings up and down depending on who is at the White House. So the popularity of the US and the approval ratings of his president plummeted with George Bush Jr. Then Obama was elected, and they skyrocketed very high. And they remained remarkably high throughout the two Obama administrations. There was a European love affair with Obama. In 2016, when at the end of Obama's second term, I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post on Obamania, this persistent infatuation of Europe with Barack Obama, which was hard to make sense of. I mean, even Obama was urging the Europeans to share the NATO burden more and blah, blah, blah. I mean, he wasn't such a pro-European president. And nevertheless, the level of approval of Obama, the infatuation with Obama remained very high. So I tried to make sense of that. And the environmental policies, Obama's involvement in the COP21 in Paris was surely very important, and I came out with a few explanations. By the way, the very first comment from one of the readers, because you check what kind of feedback you can get from the readers, was, quote, "You Eurotrash." He was referring to me. He called me Euro. I've never been called Eurotrash before. "You Eurotrash, you can take your Obama, etc., etc." But anyway, then first Trump was elected, and just back. When I say back, it's like below 15% of approval. In Germany and France, below 10%. Hungary, the most pro-Trump country, 22%. Remarkably lower. Biden, Biden was no Obama, and there was no Biden mania, but still, it did go up, and then again, it did plummet. What does it mean in a nutshell? It means that the myth of America is still there. It can be reactivated. It depends on the messenger, it depends on policies, right? When we say anti-Americanism, it's not something that is there permanently. It all depends on the kind of attitude and policies. And the myth of Obama, the myth of poietic, the ability to generate a myth, the myth of the US that Obama was able to reactivate speaks volumes about the potential resilience of that myth. Having said all of that, that myth is taking quite a beating today. That's for sure. It's for someone, who teaches US history and whose main task is to dismantle or challenge the many stereotypes of the US that your students have, the many prejudicial attitudes they have. Nowadays, go into the classroom and explaining to your French students that the US is a way more complicated story than the one they think it is, it's not that simple. So Donald Trump is making our job, teaching US history, remarkably complicated. So you can blame him for that as well. You can add that to the list.
Won't someone think of the historians?
Yeah.
Won't someone?
Never.
So we have another question here that I think actually kind of needles down on this point in an interesting way, and this idea of the American myth especially. So this is from Sophia. How much of your vision of America is changed by current events, if at all? Or do the core values of your America remain the same, regardless of the constant change in the news cycle? So there's one way of thinking about it as a sense of myth, but also, like, at least from your perspective, is there like a core sense of like what American values are that remain constant amid elections, right? That you might be able to say, well, we can close the door on the last 4 years because the next president's here and we're beginning our history over again to some degree.
What are national values? Mario's been talking about the complexities of the American story and how you communicate that to students. And there are many Americas, there are many United States, and they're all at play, and you had a civil war, for God's sake. And so that, I think, I don't necessarily think either of those versions of the national story are rooted in this moment. They both have deep histories. There is more than two of them, and they both have futures. And, a lot of that is, I believe in both of them. And I think, part of my national story is when a settler colonial violent project is hitched to a story of progressivism and liberal democracy. Those are in fact the same story in Australia. That a lot of the justification, my current research is on educational land endowments. Public education, great thing, right? Progressive policy, funded with displaced, Indigenous land, right? Those are the same thing. And so I think when we are telling our own histories, well, it's so at the forefront of the way Australian history is being written at the moment, and it is such a prominent thread in American history too, that those are the same thing, and they're both there to be animated, and we have to be honest about them being the same thing in the past. And sometimes when I think, the focus on 250, on the Declaration of Independence, and the constitution that follows, is a very kind of European and transatlantic conversation. And in a way, it's easier to see the history. The United States is not made at the Declaration of Independence. I'm an outsider telling you this. But, the continental United States is made the Mexican War, right? It's made in the 19th century. And remembering that part of the national story really helps us understand this moment. It's not separate from the Democratic and Republican one. But, yeah, I'm waffling now.
So going back to the Declaration. Now, the Declaration of Independence, there are many books. There's one.
Many books.
There are many books on it. One I like a lot. It's actually not a book. It was an article which was then stretched into a mostly useless book, but the article was very, very good. It came out on the William and Mary Quarterly in 2002 by Armitage, a British historian. And the Declaration of Independence is a declaration of interdependence. The moment you claim sovereignty is relational. It depends on you being recognized by others. It means that you are joining a community. You leave a transnational imperial British space, which is big but not global, universal, and you joined a community of states, which is truly global. So you join the world, and you are part of it, and you are dependent on it. That's the very essence of interdependence. So, first point, the US story is always part of a larger story. It depends on that larger story, and it does impact that larger story, especially once the US rose to global preeminence. That's my first point. So you really need to consider that. To de-exceptionalize the US by inserting the US within a larger story. There is a second form of interdependence in the document, which is at the very end. We pledge our lives to each other our lives. It's a powerful message. You pledge your life to someone else, which is part of your community. You are a community. So you are nothing alone. You are part of a larger community to the point that you pledge your life to the other members of that community. Those are, to me, the two most powerful messages, if you want to call them so, coming from the Declaration of Independence. And they seem to be kind of lost nowadays, right? There is a clear attempt to escape interdependence. Think about the Golden Dome, the idea that you can become invulnerable again from a missile attack, that you can free yourself from the straitjacket of nuclear deterrence, The rest of the world remains dependent and mutually dependent for their security, indeed for their own survival. And you get out of the community and you stand alone, right? And think about this, if you want to call it so, national, domestic community interdependence, and how the current hyperpolarization has just, is breaking these ties and these bonds. So to make a very long story short, it's hard to be optimistic nowadays. I mean, what we are seeing is, I don't know, it doesn't apply to the US, only to the US. I mean, there's a broader kind of crisis of democracy across at least the North Atlantic, Euro, North American space. The case of Italy, but the case of France itself. I mean, we live off kind of emergency legislation. Parliaments don't produce laws anymore. It's a government by presidential decrees, executive orders. So it's a broader crisis of the democratic compact, so to speak. Some of my Americanist colleagues are urging a boycott of the US. Don't go to Missouri. I mean, nice people, but just stay away from Missouri. They won't let you in, they will question you, the immigration, etc., etc. But jokes aside, one of our students, a doctoral student in political science, she was refused a J1 visa to spend a year at Columbia University because of some Facebook post. Okay? And yeah, a French colleague flew to Houston and was sent back after spending a day at the airport. Those are small things compared to what's going on in fully authoritarian countries, but for us, it's unprecedented, okay? Literally unprecedented. And honestly, and Jay and Tamson know this, we discussed it, and the Kinder Center was kind enough to provide, a lot of documents proving that we were here, we had resources, we'd fly back very soon, we will not stay long, etc., etc., etc. But I never felt so uneasy about entering the US as I did in this very last time, okay? And I'm supposed to be here on a fellowship this fall, and there is a serious chance, a realistic chance, I will not get the visa, which is something I never worried about until today, okay? So, yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. To begin wrapping up, I wanted to actually pull together something that a number of these great questions are pointing to, because there's a few of these questions that have the word hope with a question mark after it. And so I wondered if, in wrapping up, we can look ahead a little bit and think about where that hope might be, and if there is in looking perhaps over this longer period of American history, 250 years or so of it as a declared nation, is there a moment or a trajectory or a trend or an idea or an ideal that perhaps does give some hope for the future as we move forward in our own lives?
I'll go first. I actually think that's easy.
Is it?
Well, maybe not. No, the doing of it is not easy. But I read a lot of John Dewey, who was a progressive educational thinker from the late 19th, early 20th century. And he had an argument about how publics come to be. That publics are multiple, for one. but they're created when different people come to a realization that they're all suffering the same thing, that there's something wrong. The water is polluted or whatever, and they come to an understanding. So they come to consciousness about it, and then forge together an alliance to care for that thing that they all have in common. And I really think that it's the American people that are the hope, are you. Yeah. And I think that what's interesting about that idea of John Dewey's is that there is a real role in there for historians or intellectuals, or because how is it to come to consciousness of something? That is actually the task at the moment. How do the people affected by the, harmed by the current turn, come to consciousness of it and its causes, and then act together to care for each other and for the thing they hold in common? Well, how do they come to consciousness? They come through various kinds of story making, through actions on the streets, outside today, in Minnesota. These are all ways that the community comes to consciousness and a public is made. And I think it's that project of making a public that is the one before you at the moment, but I think you are as ever, the people are as ever the best hope for change. Not to sound like a...
So, Tamson will be running for office soon. She gave a powerful motivational speech. I
get to go home tomorrow.
You have my vote. You have my vote. You have my vote. This is a question, Billy, that pushes us to be a bit rhetorical, right? And I fully subscribe to what Tamson just said. That applies everywhere. Civic participation, activism is vital. Now, where does the study of history help? History is about, I do believe, it's about change. That's what we study, change over time. That's why I don't like applied history models and stuff, because they're based on the assumption that history repeats itself. It's cyclical, which is the very antithesis of my understanding of history. History is change over time. You look for causality, causes and consequences, turning points, watersheds, etc., etc. The history is first and foremost about complexity. I teach at Sciences Po in Paris, which is a very strange school. It does form the French elites. It did form the French elites and still does. The vast majority of presidents, prime ministers, ministers of the Fifth Republic have come through Sciences Po. Sarkozy never finished it, but he was there for a few years, right? Attal was a student of mine. He was prime minister. It's amazing, isn't it? And so I have in front, in typical French fashion, I have to give these big lectures in an amphitheater, les cours magistraux. So I have these 500 students. And many of them, they could not care less about history. They have to be there, it's a mandatory class, and they want applied knowledge. Give me something that it will be useful for me when I'll be running the Minister of Foreign Affairs. That's the attitude. I'm half serious. And what I tell them is that through history, you learn complexity. And if you learn complexity, you learn to think in complex terms. You somehow learn empathy. Because if things are complex, multifaceted, somehow your political opponent or someone who has a different idea can be better understood. He, she, they might be partially right. Right? There are no absolute truth one way or the other. And if you have this kind of historical awareness, you can engage in a dialogue with someone who has a different opinion, and you can just consider him, her, them a legitimate interlocutor, so to speak, not an absolute enemy, not an illegitimate interlocutor, so to speak. So studying history generates or should generate an awareness of complexity, which then translates into empathy. And empathy, no matter what we are told nowadays, it's a virtue, it's an asset, it's a resource, it's what keeps us together. See, I got my round of applause. I can run for office too now. But it's vital. To me, and I'll stop here, something remarkably striking of the public discussion, public conversation, political debate today is the lack of empathy, or empathy is presented, as I said, as a vice, as a form of weakness, whereas it's what keeps us together as a community, as a global community. Thanks.
Well, thank you. We don't need to worry. We're going to give each of you plenty of applause in just a moment. But I think this has been a really wonderful conversation. What a great place to end up at a point of empathy. And the wonderful thing for us, unfortunately not for the two of you, is that we get to continue this conversation over the rest of the semester. So we will be back here in 2 weeks' time, 5 p.m. To hear from Erica Pani from the College of Mexico, and then the week after that from Eliza Reid, a Canadian author and former First Lady of Iceland. So these are two events to definitely put on your calendars. After we give a big round of applause to Mario and Tamson, we have a reception for everyone to enjoy. Look forward to some nice hors d'oeuvres. There's going to be a bar at the back, and there is a bar just outside the doors, and you can go into other parts of the foyer in the hotel. You don't all have to stay crunched in this space in order to enjoy the reception. But please, let's give it up for our speakers. Mario.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks so much to you all. It's lovely speaking in front of such a large crowd. Thanks so much for coming.